Honestly, your husband is an idiot. The luxury SUV, a symbol of fleeting victory, sliced through the midnight darkness, its headlights a cold, unyielding judgment. Inside the grand, echoing halls of what was once his sanctuary, Elias Vance stood. This house, once a testament to shared dreams, now felt alien, a stage set for a final act. Laughter, bright and careless, spilled from the car. Seraphina's laughter, triumphant, unburdened. She had returned from her business trip, not alone, but with Victor Sterling, the man she now openly embraced, and his entire family. They stepped onto the historic Vance Estate as if it were already their conquest, their inheritance. What they didn't know was that the silence within wasn't the hush of defeat. It was the profound stillness of meticulous preparation. The walls, stripped bare, whispered no secrets. The rooms, once vibrant with life, now echoed with the absence of everything that had defined their shared existence. Legally, quietly, completely erased. Seraphina believed she had won. She didn't comprehend that the game had concluded weeks ago, and she was arriving, tragically, far too late to play. Before we unveil this cinematic confrontation, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? If you're ready for a story of unwavering resilience and ultimate vindication, subscribe and join our community. The SUV glided into the driveway just after midnight, its powerful beams cutting across the manicured lawn, freezing. On a weathered, hand-carved sign near the curb, "For sale," the letters, stark and unapologetic, declared a new truth. Inside, Elias Vance stood motionless in the dim, vast kitchen, his hands, steady, rested on the cold granite counter. He listened as the engine died, as car doors opened. Laughter followed, bright, unguarded, unmistakably hers. It seeped under the grand oak door like a toxic gas, familiar and poisonous all at once. He didn't move to the window. He didn't need to see her to know exactly how she would look. Stepping out, hair gleaming under the porch light, posture relaxed, the self-satisfied smile she wore when she truly believed she was untouchable. For weeks, he had practiced this moment in his mind, breathing through the phantom pain, rehearsing calm with the precision of a master strategist. Tonight wasn't about anger. Anger had burned itself to ash long ago. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Another laugh, deeper this time, male, then to more voices, older, confident, already discussing the property as if it were an open house, a mere transaction. Elias closed his eyes. The house answered with a hollow echo. It had been emptied with surgical precision, room by room, like a museum preparing for a dignified demolition. No framed wedding photos lined the grand hallway. No abstract art Seraphina loved to boast about at lavish dinner parties. The antique display cabinet where her jewels once glittered stood hollow, glass shelves, catching nothing but the encroaching shadows. Even the faint, cloying scent of her perfume had vanished, replaced by the clean, impersonal aroma of fresh paint and cardboard. The front door swung open without ceremony. Seraphina's heels clicked against the polished hardwood, sharp and certain. Then they stopped. "What happened to the lights?" she demanded, irritation already a venomous whisper in her voice. Elias turned then. Finally, he leaned against the counter, the single overhead bulb casting a soft halo that paradoxically sharpened his features, making him appear larger, more formidable than she remembered. He watched her eyes adjust, watched confusion ripple across her face as she took in the vast emptiness. The man beside her, Victor, tall, impeccably polished, wearing confidence like a tailored suit, offered a polite, almost apologetic smile, as if this were a minor inconvenience, not a devastating revelation. Behind him stood his parents, assessing, whispering, already visibly disappointed. "Long trip?" Elias asked, his voice surprising even himself, steady, almost kind. Seraphina stared at him, then past him, scanning the barren kitchen. "Where's the table?" she said. "And the art?" "Elias, what is this?" He gestured gently, palm open, as if inviting her to look closer, to truly see. "You're late," he said. "Everything's already gone." The words landed heavier than he'd imagined. A final, irrevocable truth. He saw it then, the precise moment her certainty shattered. Not guilt, not remorse, but raw, primal fear. the kind that grips you when all leverage, all control, slips through your fingers. She laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. Stop. This isn't funny. She turned to Victor, searching for reinforcement, for an ally. He's being dramatic. Elias watched the performance without reacting. He had seen it all before. The charm, the dismissive wave, the swift pivot. For years, he had mistaken it for strength. He had mistaken himself for lucky. Outside, rain began to tap against the grand windows. Soft at first, then harder, filling the silence with its relentless rhythm. Elias's mind drifted backward, uninvited, to the first night. He noticed something was wrong. A canceled dinner, a phone turned face down. The way she began to speak of her life, as if he were an accessory, not a partner. He remembered telling himself it was stress. Ambition, a phase. Love, he'd believed, meant patience. It wasn't one betrayal that undid him. It was the pattern, the careful way lies stacked on top of each other, their weight bearing down. The way. She planned her exits long before announcing them. The realization had come quietly, without theatrics. On a Tuesday morning while she slept beside him, her phone buzzing with a message she didn't hear. He'd read it by accident, or perhaps by fate. The words had been affectionate, familiar, strategic. From that moment, Elias had stopped asking questions out loud. He started listening instead. Now, standing in the hollow shell of what used to be his marriage, he felt the strange, profound relief of alignment. What he knew and what he saw finally matched. Seraphina took a step forward, lowering her voice, a desperate plea. "Where are my things?" "Sold," Elias said. "The ones I owned. I listed the house, closed the accounts I was legally entitled to close. Everything was documented." Her face flushed, a mask of disbelief. "You can't do that." "I did." The older man, Victor's father, cleared his throat, his voice laced with disdain. "This is highly irregular," he said, peering at Elias. "We can discuss this privately." Elias met his gaze, unwavering. "There's nothing private left." The rain intensified, drumming against the glass, a final, resounding applause for justice. As if urging the dawn, Elias Vance felt a tremor pass through him. Not fear, not regret, but the seismic shift of reclaiming his soul, a declaration echoing through generations. He didn't know how this would end, only that it had already begun, long before this driveway, long before this return to claim his legacy. The surrender Seraphina Thorne expected wasn't the one she found. Elijah, standing amidst the echoes of a stolen past, was done being written as the fool, before the confrontation could deepen, before explanations turned into accusations. One truth stood between them, undeniable and raw. Betrayal had brought her here, but unwavering resolve had been waiting, and whatever followed next would redefine all their lives forever. Seraphina's first instinct was to assert control. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and smoothed an invisible crease from her designer coat, as if composure alone could reverse what her eyes were screaming. The stark emptiness wasn't accidental. It was intentional, a strategic dismantling. "You undermined me," she hissed, her voice a whip. "You had no right." Elijah offered no defense. He simply observed the desperate clench of her hand on her expensive purse, her gaze darting, searching for any familiar anchor in the stripped bare space. Every vestige of her curated life, every symbol of their shared past, had been meticulously removed. "I didn't go behind your back," he stated, his voice a low, steady current. "I stepped into my own light." Julian Sterling, the man beside her, visibly bristled, his veneer of corporate calm cracking. "This is a simple misunderstanding," he interjected, stepping forward as if proximity equaled authority. "We can resolve this discreetly." Elijah's gaze finally met his, piercing through the carefully constructed facade. He saw the curated confidence, the entitlement etched into every line of his expensive suit, the very embodiment of the system Seraphina had embraced. "There's nothing left to resolve," Elijah countered, his words cutting through the tension. "You are merely guests." Lady Thorne, Julian's mother, scoffed, her gaze sweeping the empty hall with disdain. "Guests? There's nothing here." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the relentless rain, a drumbeat against the windows, Seraphina's breath hitched, then steadied, her voice softening into a practiced, manipulative plea. "Elijah, darling, I understand you're upset, but this is drastic. We can discuss this like rational adults." A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. Adults. The word tasted like ash, a bitter reminder of every compromise, every swallowed truth, every time he'd been told to trust while his spirit was eroded. "You didn't talk to me," he stated, his gaze unwavering. "You orchestrated." Her eyes flashed. "That's unfair." "It's the truth," he affirmed. Lord and Lady Thorne exchanged a subtle, telling glance. This wasn't the broken man they'd anticipated, the one who would beg. This wasn't their script. Elijah felt the profound weariness of a soul long denied justice, not just personal fatigue, but the burden of generations of silent struggle. He remembered the nights he'd mistaken pain for loyalty, the mornings he'd sat with the attorney. Her eyes kind but resolute. "You don't need revenge," she'd advised. "You need liberation. You need clarity." And clarity, sharp and unyielding, was the sword he now wielded. "You sold the ancestral home," Seraphina gasped, her composure finally shattering. "Where are we supposed to live?" The word we hung in the air, a hollow, self-serving echo. Elijah simply shrugged. "You made your arrangements long ago." Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. For a fleeting moment, he saw the frantic calculation in her eyes, the rapid inventory of dwindling options. She spun to Julian, her voice a desperate whisper. "You promised this wouldn't happen." Julian's jaw tightened. "I said I'd handle it." Lord Thorne cleared his throat, his voice a low warning. "This is hardly the place, son. We'll leave." Seraphina spun, disbelief etched on her face. "Leave." Elijah simply stepped aside, a silent gesture towards the door. "That would be wise." She stared, as if seeing a ghost, a stranger. The man she'd once known, accommodating and forgiving, was gone. This Elijah stood unyielding, his quiet resolve more terrifying than any rage. "You're doing this to punish me," she accused, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he replied, his gaze steady. "I'm doing this to live, to reclaim what was stolen." The rain, now a relentless downpour, plastered their expensive clothes to their bodies as they retreated. SUV doors slammed with a finality that echoed the end of an era. Elijah watched from the threshold, a lone sentinel, as their tail lights vanished into the storm, leaving behind only wet pavement and a sign, newly erected, proclaiming Vance Legacy Center. As the heavy door closed, the silence that enveloped him was not empty, but profound, a sacred space earned through struggle. Elijah exhaled, the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. His phone buzzed, a single, urgent message from his sister, Imani. "Are you safe? Are you whole?" He hadn't replied then. Now, he typed, "I am, finally, and we are just beginning." He walked through the now empty rooms, his footsteps echoing not with loss, but with the promise of a new dawn. Each space, once a cage of memory, was now a canvas for the future. In the main hall, where the community would gather, he sat, grounding himself in the present, in the power of his truth. He knew this wasn't the end. The whispers of accusation, the legal battles, the attempts to paint him as a villain, they would come, but he was ready. He was no longer just Elijah Vance. He was a symbol of resilience, a voice for justice. The thought no longer terrified him. The truth, a quiet storm, didn't need theatrics. It needed unwavering resolve. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, a prelude to change. Elijah stood, extinguishing the last light, leaving the ancestral home cloaked in shadow. Tomorrow, there would be legal battles, public scrutiny, systemic backlash. But tonight, there was something else, a sacred space. For the first time in years, the future, once a cage, now stretched boundless. And though the cost had been immeasurable, the price of silence had been the soul itself. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale, defiant light seeping through the blinds of the temporary sanctuary Elijah had rented weeks earlier, a place chosen not for comfort, but for its stark neutrality. No shared memories, no haunting echoes, just clean lines and borrowed furniture that didn't demand a single emotion. He lay still for a moment, listening to the city's waking hum, letting the quiet settle deep into his chest, a new kind of peace. His phone buzzed, a venomous vibration, before he even sat up. "You dared to speak truth to power last night. You think this ends well for you." He didn't need to see the name. The message carried the same chilling tone Seraphina Thorne had always used. When she sensed her iron grip on the narrative slipping, accusatory, self-righteous, designed to provoke a reaction, Elias stared at the screen. Then, with deliberate calm, he set the phone face down. He wasn't going to start his day by stepping back into her toxic orbit. The knock came an hour later, sharp, insistent. He opened the door to find her standing there, alone. This time, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, hair pulled back tight. She looked smaller without her usual entourage, without an audience. More human, more dangerous. "We need to talk," she said, already stepping inside, claiming space. "No," Elijah replied, holding the door frame, a barrier. "You want to talk," she scoffed, turning back. Her voice laced with fury. "You exposed the rot beneath the gilded facade. You made me look weak. You did that yourself." Her jaw clenched, a muscle twitching. "You tried to sell our legacy, our community's future. I sold what I legally could." He said evenly, his voice a steady current. "You'll see it in the filings." She ripped off her sunglasses, eyes flashing with predatory fire. "You think legal maneuvers make you clean?" He studied her face, the familiar angles, the eyes that once softened with shared laughter, now sharp with cold calculation. He felt something surprising stir beneath the exhaustion. Not longing, not anger, pure, unyielding clarity. "I think deceit breeds ruin," he said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "And ruin has consequences." She stepped closer, lowering her voice, a viper's hiss. "Do you know what people are saying about you already?" "Yes, and you're fine with that." "I am fine with the truth catching up." Her laugh was hollow, brittle. "You always thought you were better than everyone else, moral. Above it all, no." Elijah said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "I just stopped pretending. I chose to live authentically, for my people." She searched his face for something, hesitation, regret, the old softness she could exploit. Finding none, she straightened, her armor snapping back into place. "You can't erase me," she declared, a desperate plea for relevance. "Half of what you had, your very platform, was because of me." "That's the narrative of the oppressor, Seraphina," Elijah replied. "It's not the one that records. Or history will tell." Her eyes flicked toward the door, a flicker of uncertainty. She hesitated, then turned away without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the sanctuary unchanged, unburdened. Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. By afternoon, the messages began circulating. Friends he hadn't spoken to in months reached out with cautious check-ins, whispers of solidarity. Others went silent. Social media shifted, photos disappeared, narratives adjusted. Seraphina Thorne was rewriting her own history in real time. But Elijah knew better than to chase the fiction. He met with Amara Singh that evening via video call. Her expression was calm, unruffled, the way it always was, when she had already thought 5 steps ahead, a strategist for justice. "She's trying to frame this as financial abuse," Amara said. "It won't stick if you stay disciplined." "I expected that," Elijah replied. "She also lied on a preliminary disclosure," Amara continued. "A small thing. But lies, like rot, compound." Elijah nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," Amara said, a rare smile touching her lips. "You've already done the hardest part." Nothing impulsive. After the call ended, Elijah sat alone, the weight of the past weeks finally catching up to him. His chest tightened, not with panic, but with a profound grief, the weight of generations, the burden of injustice. He pressed his palms into his eyes, and for the first time since the truth had surfaced, he let himself feel the loss without bargaining, the fractured dream, the version of the future he'd believed in, the man he'd been when he thought endurance was love, not complicity. A knock interrupted his thoughts. This one was softer, a gentle reassurance. His sister, Aisha, stood in the doorway, rain-damp hair tucked into her coat, eyes warm and worried, a beacon of unwavering support. He hadn't heard her come in. "You didn't answer my texts," she said. He stepped aside. "I didn't know what to say." She hugged him without asking. a fierce embrace. He stiffened for half a second, then let go, the contact grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. "You okay?" she asked, her voice a bomb. "I don't know," he admitted, a raw honesty. "But I'm not lost." They sat at the small kitchen table, sharing takeout in silence, a communion of resilience. He told her everything, not with drama, not with embellishment, just facts, patterns, decisions. She listened without interrupting, without trying to fix him, simply bearing witness. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. "For what? For standing tall, for reclaiming our narrative, for choosing justice without succumbing to their hatred." That night, alone again, Elijah stood by the window and watched the city breathe. Lights flickered on and off in neighboring buildings, each one holding a story, a struggle, a dream. His phone buzzed once more. Another message from Seraphina. Longer this time. He didn't open it. The future no longer needed her explanation, her twisted narrative. It would unfold on its own terms now, forged by truth and resilience. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt ready to meet it. Steady, awake, and no longer afraid of the quiet. For in it, he found his strength. The first legal notice arrived 3 days later, slid under Elijah's door like a gauntlet thrown. He read it twice, not because it surprised him, but because he wanted to absorb the language without emotion. Allegations of financial misconduct, their desperate attempt to silence the voice of justice. Accusations of inciting unrest, of disrupting the delicate balance of their order, and causing economic instability. The official communiqué, crafted by a legion of high-priced legal minds, echoed through the sterile halls of power. Elijah forwarded it to Aisha, then sought solace in the city's pulse. The city felt sharper now, sounds clearer, as if confronting a pervasive lie had recalibrated his very soul, exposing the raw truth beneath. At a crosswalk, a young couple shared a quiet moment, hands clasped, a silent promise of solidarity. It was a poignant reminder of the humanity he fought to protect. He kept walking. By the time he returned, Aisha's message had arrived, calm, direct, a blueprint for justice. They met in Aisha's community legal center the next morning. The space was functional, purposeful, adorned with murals of struggle and triumph, a testament to their shared history. Aisha listened as Elijah detailed the escalating tactics, the veiled threats, the public smear campaigns, the sudden, aggressive pivot towards discrediting his every action. When he finished, she nodded, unsurprised. "They're escalating because the soft tactics of division and dismissal didn't work," Aisha stated. "That tells me they're worried." "Worried about what?" Elijah asked. "Control," Aisha replied. "And exposure." Aisha slid a thick dossier across the desk. Inside were meticulously compiled records, historical land deeds, discriminatory zoning laws, audited reports of resource allocation, dates, official statements, public declarations, all meticulously cross-referenced with the lived experiences of the community. Small inconsistencies, highlighted in red, screamed volumes. Their public pronouncements say one thing, but the data tells another story. Lies don't exist in isolation, Elijah. They leave fingerprints. Elijah felt a slow, steady heat build in his chest, not anger, but a profound, unshakable resolve. "What happens next?" he asked. "We let them keep talking," Aisha said, her voice firm. "And we keep documenting every single injustice." The establishment's version of events spread quickly. Wrapped in public safety concerns and selective truths, they painted Elijah as a radical, a disruptor of peace. They hinted at unpredictable elements and controlling influences within the movement, letting the media fill in the gaps with fear. Some believed the narrative, others stayed silent, unsure which version of their shared history to trust. The hardest blow came from an official summons, a public accountability hearing designed to scrutinize his leadership. Carefully neutral, but heavy with implication, the panel questioned him. He answered plainly, provided irrefutable documentation, refused to speculate or be provoked. When it ended, he sat in the quiet of his community center, hands resting on a worn wooden table, breathing through the familiar ache of a fight not yet won, but not lost either. That night, he dreamed of a world as it could be, warm light, shared laughter, a version of humanity where dignity was inherent, not earned. A world that still believed justice was earned by relentless endurance. He woke before dawn, heart racing, and reminded himself that dreams were not just echoes of the past, but blueprints for the future. The date for the Public Justice Tribunal was set quickly. Victoria Thorne, the architect of the accusations, wanted speed, pressure, a public resolution she could spin. They met in the imposing grand hall of the tribunal, all polished marble and muted power. Victoria Thorne arrived first, flanked by a phalanx of corporate lawyers. Her expression was composed, eyes already scanning for advantage, when Elijah entered with Aisha. A flicker of unease crossed Thorne's face for a fraction of a second, before smoothing into a practiced, condescending smile. "Elijah," she purred, "I trust you're well." He didn't respond. The chief adjudicator began with sterile pleasantries. "Then, the ground rules." Victoria Thorne spoke first, her voice carefully modulated, confidence giving way to a feigned vulnerability as she spoke of disruption and threats to public harmony. She spoke of divisive rhetoric, of unilateral actions that bypassed established channels, of decisions made without due process. She painted her institution as one forced into a defensive posture by unwarranted aggression. Elijah listened, hands folded, gaze steady, a silent testament to his people's enduring strength. Each sentence felt like a stone dropped into the still waters of justice. Aisha had warned him, "Let their words pass. The truth will speak louder." When it was their turn, Aisha didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She laid out dates, historical records, official documents. She presented timelines of discriminatory policies, patterns of systemic resource deprivation, and official communications that directly contradicted Thorne's public statements. Each one meticulously documented, each one quietly dismantling the narrative of fairness and equality Thorne's institution had built. Thorne's lead counsel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The chief adjudicator's pen paused. "That's not the full context," Thorne interjected, her voice sharp. "You're cherry-picking." Aisha nodded slowly. "Then let's add context." She introduced a final, damning document, a historical decree, signed by Thorne's predecessors, explicitly outlining discriminatory practices. It asserted unintentional disparity, while simultaneously detailing policies that ensured it. Aisha placed a statement on the table showing the devastating, long-term impact. The grand hall went very still. Victoria Thorne's face drained of color. "That's a historical anomaly," she stammered. "I must have misinterpreted the intent." "Under oath, Miss Thorne," the chief adjudicator asked gently. The words hung there, heavy and irrevocable. Thorne's composure cracked, not dramatically, but subtly. Her shoulders stiffened, her eyes darted toward Elijah, then away. For the first time, the impenetrable facade of the establishment wavered. She looked uncertain. A recess was called. Elijah stepped into the bustling corridor, palms damp, heart pounding not with fear, but with the tremor of history shifting. He leaned against a pillar, closing his eyes. This wasn't triumph, not yet. It was exposure. The crucial difference, when they reconvened, the tone had shifted. The chief adjudicator spoke of consequences, of systemic reform, of the imperative of historical accuracy. Victoria Thorne said little now, lips pressed thin. Anger simmered beneath her forced restraint. The session ended without a full resolution. But the momentum, the very narrative, had irrevocably changed. Victoria Thorne left without looking at Elijah. Her phalanx of lawyers avoided his gaze. Outside, a gentle, cleansing rain had begun to fall. Fine and persistent, Aisha handed Elijah a bottle of water. "You stood firm," she said, her voice a quiet affirmation. "I just spoke the truth," Elijah replied. "You stayed steady," Aisha corrected, her eyes meeting his. "That's everything." Days later, the fallout accelerated. The establishment's carefully constructed image began to crumble. Public trust eroded. Whispers of systemic injustice replaced blind acceptance. Key endorsements and partnerships quietly dissolved, ending with polite, corporate-speak emails citing evolving brand alignment concerns. The old guard's silent influence began to wane. The ladder of systemic privilege, once unassailable, was being dismantled, rung by painful rung. Elijah watched it all from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a growing sense of the long road ahead. He began community healing initiatives. He returned to the sacred spaces of his ancestors, not to punish, but to reclaim the strength within. He shared simple meals with his people. He slept through the night, a peace earned through unwavering resilience. One evening, a final, chilling message from Seraphina flickered on Elijah's screen. "I didn't think you'd dare go this far." Elijah stared at the words, his thumb hovering. He typed back, "You left me no choice but to reclaim what's mine." He set the phone down, stepping onto the balcony. The sprawling city, a tapestry of dreams and forgotten promises, stretched before him. The path ahead was still shrouded in mist, court dates, final rulings, loose ends. But the suffocating fog of doubt had lifted. He could see the road now, narrow and arduous, yet undeniably his. For the first time since the betrayal began to unravel, Elijah felt a profound sense of peace. Not because the struggle was over, but because his story, his truth, was finally his to tell. The day of reckoning dawned, a clear morning that seemed cruelly indifferent to the monumental weight Elijah carried into the courthouse. Sunlight, bright and sterile, pierced the glass atrium, as if the world refused to dim its brilliance for the private catastrophes of the marginalized. He walked through security, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble, and found his place beside Aisha. She offered a silent, powerful nod, no performative gesture, just the unwavering reassurance of a warrior prepared for battle. Across the aisle, Seraphina sat with her counsel, posture rigid, chin defiantly lifted. She avoided Elijah's gaze until, finally, her eyes flickered to him, brief, unreadable, like checking a clock she no longer controlled. Elijah felt the familiar knot of old wounds tighten in his chest, then consciously breathed through it. He wasn't there for her understanding. He was there for justice. The proceedings moved with a methodical, almost brutal precision. Statements were entered, objections raised and addressed. The judge's questions direct, stripped of all pretense. When Seraphina testified, she spoke with a calculated fragility, choosing words. As if treading on fragile ice, she painted herself as an overwhelmed victim, misled, fearful. She returned, again and again, to the insidious lie that Elijah had acted out of spite, out of a desire to destroy, rather than to build. When it was Elijah's turn, he rose, and the entire room seemed to sharpen, to focus on him. He spoke plainly, with the quiet power of truth. He described patterns of systemic exploitation, not personal insults. He laid out timelines of appropriation, not mere accusations. He explained how trust had been systematically eroded, how decisions impacting his community's legacy had been made without true consultation, how every sale, every transaction, had been documented and disclosed, only to be twisted. He did not raise his voice. He did not apologize for standing firm, for protecting his heritage. The judge listened, occasionally glancing down at the file, thick with irrefutable evidence. When Aisha introduced the final set of documents, corrected disclosures, verified records, the meticulously amended timeline exposing Seraphina's deceit, her attorney shifted, fingers tapping the table, with a frantic rhythm that betrayed deep unease. The ruling came after a brief, agonizing recess. Elijah stood, hands clasped, his heart thundering a drumbeat of anticipation. The judge's words were measured, careful, and utterly final. The court finds no evidence of financial abuse by Mr. Elias Vance. The asset sales were deemed lawful and properly executed. Ms. Seraphina Thorne is ordered to amend her filings and cover all costs incurred by her misrepresentation. Elijah didn't react with triumph. He felt something profound loosen within him, a knot untied, not violently severed. It wasn't just victory, it was vindication. Outside, the sky had clouded over, the light now softer, more forgiving. Aisha gripped his hand. "It's done, Elijah. You did it." He nodded, a silent thank you. "No," she replied, "you did the work. I just helped you tell your truth." In the weeks that followed, the noise faded, the accusatory calls stopped. The messages went unanswered, not because Elijah blocked them, but because none came. Seraphina's online presence shifted again, quieter this time, stripped of its former arrogance. He heard through Maya that she had moved, that Victor had been seen with someone else, that the powerful circles she'd believed would protect her had quietly closed ranks. Elijah didn't check. He didn't need to. He moved into a smaller place, overlooking the river, mornings filled with light, and the rhythmic hum of passing boats. He bought a second-hand table, learning to cherish the ritual of simple, honest meals. He took long walks without a destination, simply breathing. In therapy, he learned to name the moments he'd overridden his instincts, mistaking endurance of injustice for virtue. He learned that true empowerment didn't require self-erasure. One evening, months later, he found himself standing outside the ancestral streets. The house was no longer his, the sign gone. A different car in the driveway. He felt a flicker of nostalgia, then let it pass. That chapter, that burden, belonged to someone else now. At home, he opened a letter that had arrived earlier. Seraphina's handwriting was unmistakable. He considered leaving it unopened, then decided clarity didn't require avoidance. The letter was short, no accusations, no bargaining, just a cold admission that she'd underestimated him, and a line about regret that felt more like surprise than genuine sorrow. Elijah folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a marker, proof that the story had moved forward. On a quiet Sunday morning, he sat at his kitchen table, coffee cooling between his hands, and watched the river drift by. He thought about how close he'd come to staying silent, how easy it would have been to let the false narrative consume him. He thought about the man he'd been, waiting in rooms that didn't welcome him, hoping love would reward his endless patience. He understood now that healing wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrived in ordinary moments. Sleep without dread, laughter that wasn't forced, decisions made without fear of reprisal. Elijah stood and opened the window, letting the fresh air, carrying the scent of possibility, fill the room. The future was still unwritten, but it felt honest, authentic, and that, he realized, was more than he'd ever needed from it. Time changed the texture of everything. What once felt sharp, the sting of injustice, slowly dulled, not because Elijah forgot, but because he had risen. But as Elias Vance's days swelled with the tireless work of liberation, healing wasn't a sudden flash of light. It was the steady, unyielding rhythm of resistance. He woke before the dawn, not with the weight of dread, but with the quiet, burning resolve of a warrior preparing for battle. Mornings became sacred ground. Coffee brewed, not for distraction, but for clarity. The river of resilience outside his window flowed, ancient and unwavering, a silent testament. He didn't need to rush, didn't need to justify his very breath 3 times a week. He ran along that river, lungs burning, muscles aching, a primal echo of his ancestors' fight. Grateful for a body that answered the call, a vessel forged in fire, in the community. The suffocating tension began to lift, like a morning fog retreating from the sun. As vital projects took root and bore fruit, their undeniable impact silenced the whispers of doubt. The venom of old rumors. One afternoon, Aisha Khan, a pillar of their movement, drew him aside. Her eyes, deep with wisdom, met his. "Elijah," she said, her voice a low hum, "I saw the struggle. But now I see the dawn." Elijah nodded, a silent acknowledgement. He knew truth, like the river, carved its path through stone. It wasn't about fleeting spectacle, but the relentless current of consistency. The journey of healing became less about surviving the wounds of the past, and more about understanding the very architecture of oppression. He learned how easily false promises could masquerade as progress, how systemic neglect could be veiled as order, how generations had been lulled into a false sense of safety. He spoke of the long nights, wrestling with the insidious voice that whispered doubt was a personal failing. Instead of a clarion call for change, he learned that boundaries weren't walls of punishment, but sacred lines of self-determination, drawn in the sand of their collective dignity. One evening, Imani Jones, his steadfast friend, gathered them. Her apartment pulsed with the vibrant hum of shared stories, of laughter echoing like freedom songs. Friends, comrades, family flowed in and out, their joy spilling into the streets. Someone asked, "Elijah, what have you been building lately?" Elijah paused, a slow, radiant smile spreading across his face. "A life," he said, the words resonating deep within him, that needs no explanation to the architects of the past. The shadow, the oppressive system he'd fought, now flickered less often in his thoughts. A faded headline, a forgotten policy, fragments of a broken era. When it did, the image held no power, no sting. It was like recalling a role in a cruel play he'd once been forced to perform, a script he'd finally, defiantly, torn apart. Months after the landmark ruling, a victory hard won, he saw Aisha Khan by chance at the community hub. She waved him over, her eyes shining with the light of 1,000 suns. Elijah, she whispered, you carry the weight of the world no more. We are lighter. Elijah corrected, a profound truth in his voice. Turns out, liberation weighs less than the chains of oppression. They spoke of progress, of new battles, then parted ways. As Elijah walked away, he caught his reflection in a storefront window, older, yes, but steadier, a man fully, unapologetically, himself, a testament to the spirit of his people. Late one night, a notification flickered on his phone, a message request, the shadow. He stared at the name, a ghost from a past life, for a long, silent moment. Then he opened it. I know I don't deserve a response, the message read, a hollow echo of a defeated power. But I wanted to say, we see it now, we see what was done. I hope you're well. Elijah sat, the phone a cold weight in his hand. The room hushed. He felt no surge of triumph, no lingering ember of anger. He felt complete. He typed a single, resolute sentence, we are. May you find your own path to truth. He didn't wait for a reply. The conversation was over. Winter receded, yielding to the vibrant embrace of spring. The river of resilience swelled with new life. Trees budded, and the very soul of the city shifted, blossoming with color. Elijah booked a journey, not a trip, on a whim. No itinerary, no expectations, just the open road. He stood on a windswept cliff overlooking the vast ocean, the horizon stretching infinitely. The wind, a wild, untamed spirit, tugged at his jacket, and then a laugh, deep and resonant, burst from his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. It surprised him. It felt profoundly, gloriously earned. On his last night, he opened the worn notebook he'd carried through the long years of struggle. He didn't write of the system's betrayal, nor of the battles for justice. He wrote of trust, how it begins with the unwavering voice of one's own spirit, and the collective wisdom of a people. He wrote of endings that once masqueraded as crushing defeats, until time, the ultimate truth-teller, revealed them as sacred thresholds to a new era. When he returned home, he donated the last box of artifacts from the old struggle. He didn't need them anymore. The truth of their journey, their resilience, no longer required proof. One evening, as dusk painted the river of resilience in hues of gold and violet, Elijah sat at his kitchen table, reflecting on the chilling alternate history, a story where they had stayed silent. He imagined the slow, insidious erosion of their spirit, the constant second-guessing, the quiet disappearance of their collective voice, their very identity. The thought sent a profound chill through him. Not fear, but an overwhelming gratitude. The system's injustice had forced them awake. Their unwavering preparation, their collective action, had set them free. And healing, he'd learned, wasn't about vengeance or watching the oppressor fall. It was about reclaiming the sacred right to stand tall, unbowed, unapologetic. Outside, the river of resilience flowed on, indifferent to the past, constant as hope. Elijah watched it until the last sliver of light vanished, then turned back inside, closing the door gently, firmly. Their story didn't end with silence. It ended with a roar. It ended with a profound, hard-won perspective. Nearly a year after the night the old system's promises returned to an empty, crumbling edifice, Elijah found himself back in the heart of the district they had fought to reclaim, for a meeting about its vibrant future. The streets, once shadowed, now seemed to breathe with a new, expansive energy. Storefronts, once boarded up, now gleamed with new life, as if the neighborhood had quietly, defiantly moved on, not asking permission, but asserting its right to thrive. When the meeting ended early, he drove, not thinking, but guided by a deep, ancestral instinct, until he realized where he was, the old community center, once a symbol of neglect. now stood repainted, landscaped, alive again, a beacon of hope. Wind chimes, singing melodies of joy, hung where the old austerity had once reigned. New curtains, vibrant with color, framed windows that now looked out onto a brighter world. Someone else's dreams, new generations' hopes, now filled those hallowed rooms. Elijah sat in his car longer than he intended, not because he yearned for the past, but because he wanted to bear witness to what he felt. There was no ache, no pull, just a faint, profound sense of historical distance, like remembering a city you once fought for, but whose language of oppression you no longer spoke. He drove away, a quiet, triumphant smile gracing his lips. That night, he had dinner with Imani again, this time celebrating her ascension to a leadership role, a testament to their collective rise. They toasted with humble wine and laughed about childhood memories, stories untainted by the shadow of injustice, memories of pure, unburdened joy. At one point, Imani looked at him, her gaze piercing. "You know," she said softly, "you don't flinch anymore when your phone buzzes." He hadn't noticed, but she was profoundly, beautifully right. Later, alone in his apartment, Elijah stood by the window, looking out at the city they had rebuilt. He thought about how fear, once a cruel master, had finally been dethroned, replaced by the unyielding rhythm of freedom, the constant vigilance, the silent battles fought within, the way Elias Vance had lived as if peace itself was a privilege, painstakingly earned through endless struggle. Now, peace simply was. It didn't demand justification. Occasionally, the whispers of the past, the echoes of the false narrative, still surfaced, usually with lowered voices, curiosity thinly veiled as concern. Elias met them with a quiet strength, a brief, kind redirection. He didn't dignify the lies, nor did he fuel the fire of resentment. He had learned a profound truth. Refusing to carry the burden of a fabricated narrative was the purest form of liberation. One afternoon, a young activist, eyes full of nascent fire, asked him, "Elias, how did you know when to step back from the fight?" Elias paused, a lifetime of wisdom in his gaze. "I didn't walk away from the fight," he said. "I walked away from allowing the fight to consume me." That answer resonated deep within him. As summer bloomed, Elias began hosting small gatherings in his community, not extravagant, just shared meals, music, and conversations that didn't demand performance, only presence. He felt the profound difference of being chosen, not for what he could provide, but for who he truly was. Trust, he learned, blossomed in spaces where authenticity was celebrated, and silence wasn't a punishment, but a shared understanding. One evening, as he cleared plates, he caught his reflection in the kitchen mirror. He looked content, not euphoric, not invincible, but profoundly grounded. It struck him that this quiet, resilient version of himself would have terrified the man he used to be. Back then, he'd believed stability was a fragile illusion, happiness a conditional reward. He was wrong. Weeks later, the final legal paperwork arrived, a quiet, unassuming envelope in the mail. Formal confirmation that the systemic battle was truly closed. No loose ends, no appeals, no lingering shadows. He scanned and filed it away, a silent testament to a hard-won victory. He didn't celebrate with fanfare. Instead, he went for a walk. The river, a symbol of enduring strength, was high that day, sunlight fracturing into 1,000 diamonds on its surface. He watched it for a long time, contemplating how water never argues with obstacles. It adapts. It moves. It finds another way. On the walk home, he passed a community bookstore and on impulse went in. He bought a blank journal. Thick, unlined pages, waiting. At home, he opened it and with a steady hand, wrote one sentence on the first page. "I trust the truth within me now." That was all. The rest of the pages remained empty, not because he lacked words, but because he finally understood that not every chapter needed to be immediately defined. Some stories needed space to breathe, to unfold organically. That night, before bed, Elias turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his own breathing, a symphony of resilience. He thought about the man he'd been on the night the false narrative had first tried to reclaim him, standing in an empty house, calm, not because he was cold, but because he was done betraying his own truth. He didn't regret the arduous preparation. He didn't regret the hard-won outcome. What he regretted, briefly and softly, was how long it had taken him to truly believe that his dignity, his very existence, was worth defending. Sleep came easily, and somewhere beyond the quiet, the future waited, not as a promise, not as a threat, but as an open door. Elias Vance was no longer afraid to walk through. The invitation arrived without drama, tucked between utility bills and a community flyer. Its simplicity was almost suspicious. A small card, cream paper, Elias Vance's name printed cleanly on the front. It was from the Alliance for Systemic Justice, an organization he'd joined years ago, but rarely engaged with. An annual summit of truth, 3 days by the coast, limited attendance. He set it aside at first, telling himself he didn't need another disruption. Then, later that night, he picked it up again. Why not? He thought. The drive down the coastal highway was long and quiet, the kind that invited reflection, whether you sought it or not. Elias rolled the windows down, letting the ocean wind cut through the car, carrying away fragments of old tension he hadn't realized were still clinging to him, like dust. By the time he arrived, the sun was low, painting the vast expanse of water in copper and gold, a scene almost theatrical in its grandeur. The summit was understated. No grand speeches, no performative networking, just conversations that unfolded naturally. Without agenda, Elias found himself talking easily, listening more than speaking, noticing how profoundly different it felt to be truly present. Without guarding himself, no one there knew the full weight of his past. He wasn't a cautionary tale or a rumor. He was just Elias. On the second evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. A tempest mirroring the struggles they all understood. The group gathered inside, candles flickering as rain battered the windows. Someone suggested sharing stories, not achievements, but moments that had irrevocably changed them. Elias considered excusing himself, old instincts of self-preservation stirring. Then he stayed. When it was his turn, he didn't recount betrayal or courtrooms. He spoke about the insidious nature of silence, about the moment he realized he'd been shrinking his own truth to preserve a peace that was never real, about how fear had dressed itself up as loyalty to a broken system. He didn't name the false narrative. He didn't need to. The room listened, a collective understanding in their eyes. Afterward, a woman approached him, thoughtful eyes and a steady presence. She didn't offer sympathy. She didn't ask questions designed to excavate pain. She simply said, "Thank you for speaking your truth." It mattered. They talked long after the others drifted away. Conversation moving from books to the fight for justice, to the strange, profound comfort of starting over. There was no spark he felt compelled to chase, no future he felt pressured to immediately define. Just ease. When Elias returned home, he noticed a subtle, profound shift, not loneliness, but possibility. The understanding that true connection didn't demand the sacrifice of self, that genuine interest could exist without urgency or expectation. He carried that realization lightly, like a powerful tool he might need later. Weeks passed. Life continued in its steady, purposeful rhythm: work, runs by the river, quiet dinners. Then, one afternoon, Elias received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. A voice, clear and resonant, began, "Elias Vance, this is." The message began. It was Seraphina's voice, a ghost from a past life, raw and weary. "I'm not calling to argue. I wanted to let you know I'm moving out of state. I won't be around anymore." Elijah listened, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek, then deleted it. That night, he stood on his balcony, the city lights below him a vast, glittering tapestry of individual struggles and triumphs. He thought about closure, this elusive phantom people chased, like a final, dramatic scene that would explain everything. He understood now, with a clarity that felt like a lightning strike. That closure wasn't a gift someone bestowed upon you. It was a fierce, defiant choice you made the moment you stopped reopening old wounds, just to check if they still bled. The next morning, a new dawn breaking, he carried the last box of relics, objects that had survived simply because throwing them away felt too final. Down the stairs, He left it neatly labeled for donation, a silent ritual of release, and walked away without a single glance back. As autumn's golden embrace settled over the city, Elias Vance began volunteering, mentoring younger professionals navigating the treacherous currents of early careers. He found an unexpected, profound fulfillment in simply listening, in offering perspective forged in his own crucible, never instruction. He was a guide, not a dictator, empowering them to find their own path. One young woman, her eyes mirroring his past anxieties, asked him, "How do you know when to truly trust someone?" Elijah paused, a lifetime of lessons in his gaze. "When you don't feel like you're disappearing around them," he said. That answer, a beacon of self-worth, resonated deep within him too. One evening, he ran into Dr. Anya Sharma from the retreat, a chance encounter at a lecture. Their smiles were genuine, surprised, a spark of recognition in a crowded room. They sat together, conversation flowing as if time had never dared to pause. When they parted, there was no promise whispered, no future forced, just the quiet understanding that paths, once diverged, could gracefully intertwine again, without obligation. Walking home, Elijah felt a profound, quiet gratitude bloom in his chest, not for what he'd lost, but for the hard-won wisdom he'd gained, for the version of himself who had finally chosen the brutal honesty of his truth over the deceptive comfort of harmony, for the sheer courage it took to end a story that no longer served his soul. At home, he opened his blank journal, a sacred space for his evolving truth, and beneath the first sentence, he added a second, bold declaration: "I choose peace, even when it costs me comfort." He closed the book, placing it on the shelf not as a monument to past pain, but as a living reminder of his unwavering resolve. Outside, the mighty river flowed on, steady and unbothered, a timeless testament to resilience. Elijah watched it for a long moment, then turned off the light and went to bed, certain of one thing at last. The life ahead of him didn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. It only needed to be authentically his. Winter returned softly this time, without the biting sharpness Elijah remembered from the year before. Snow dusted the river banks and rooftops, cloaking the vibrant city in a hushed, serene silence. He welcomed it. There was something profoundly comforting about seasons, about life itself, that moved forward without asking permission. Irrefutable proof that the human spirit didn't stall just because one chapter ended in turmoil. Elijah settled into routines that no longer felt like desperate coping mechanisms, but deliberate, empowering choices. Saturday mornings became long, contemplative walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, coffee warming his hands as he observed strangers living their ordinary, extraordinary lives. He noticed how many people walked slightly hunched, as if bracing for an unseen impact. He recognized that posture. He used to wear it like a second skin. One afternoon, an email arrived from the association that had hosted the retreat. They were launching a small, impactful mentorship initiative, and wondered if he would be willing to help design it. Elijah read the message twice, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. A year ago, he would have hesitated, questioning his worth, wondering if his personal collapse disqualified him from guiding anyone else. Now, he saw it with crystal clarity. Surviving didn't make him broken, it made him experienced. It made him a beacon. He accepted. The first session was modest. 6 individuals gathered around a conference table, notebooks open, expressions etched with uncertainty and hope. Elijah didn't begin with advice. He began with a question, a gentle earthquake designed to shift their internal landscapes. What are you afraid will happen if you choose yourself? The answers came slowly, hesitantly, then in a torrent. Fear of disappointing parents, fear of losing status, fear of being utterly alone. Elijah listened, nodding, recognizing every fear like an old, unwelcome acquaintance. He didn't offer solutions. He offered presence, a sacred, non-judgmental space. By the end, the room felt lighter, as if the very act of naming the fear had weakened its grip. Driving home that evening, Elijah realized something quietly profound, a truth that resonated deep in his bones. His pain had not been wasted. It had been transformed into purpose, into power. That realization followed him into the new year. Invitations came and went. Some he accepted, others he declined without a flicker of guilt. He learned to trust the feeling in his chest when something aligned, and the subtle tension when it didn't. That internal compass, once ignored, now guided him with astonishing accuracy. One evening, Aisha called him, her voice thick with tears. A relationship she'd poured her heart into had unraveled suddenly, leaving her questioning her judgment, her very worth. Elijah listened as she spoke, her voice breaking, anger and grief tangled together in a raw, vulnerable confession. When she finished, she asked softly, "How did you know when it was really over?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He remembered the night in the empty house, the terrifying calm that had settled over him because it felt so final. "When staying requires you to betray yourself every single day," he said, his voice steady, imbued with hard-won wisdom, "it's already over. You just haven't left yet." She was quiet for a long moment, then simply thanked him. Elijah sat alone after the call ended, struck by how far he'd come. From someone desperate for reassurance to someone capable of offering it. A beacon of strength without losing himself. Spring crept back in. Tentative and bright, trees along the river bloomed, color returning to a world that had once felt stripped bare. Elijah spent more time outside, reading on benches, letting the sun warm his face. He noticed how rarely his thoughts returned to Seraphina now. When they did, there was no surge of emotion, no lingering ache, just memory, neutral and distant, like a faded photograph. One afternoon, he ran into someone from their old social circle at a bustling market. The conversation was polite, cautious. Eventually, the person said, "I heard she moved away, started over." Elijah nodded, a gentle, benevolent smile touching his lips. "I hope it's what she needs." The verdict had come, a quiet triumph that echoed through the community. That evening, Elijah cooked for himself, the aroma of spices filling his small apartment. He savored the moment, reflecting on the long road. He'd once believed justice meant vengeance against the system, but that path only promised exhaustion. What he had found instead was a deeper, more enduring power, the unwavering dignity of his people. Later, as the city hummed with a new kind of rhythm outside his window, Elijah opened his worn journal. He reread the 2 sentences he'd penned during their darkest days. They still resonated. He added a third, his hand firm. "We are allowed to rewrite the future they tried to deny us." He closed the journal, placing it carefully aside. Before bed, he stood by the window, looking out at the vibrant, resilient city glowing softly in the night. He thought about the man he had been at the beginning of this journey, standing in the shadow of injustice, a community fractured. He had braced for impact, believing that loss was the end of their story. He wished he could speak to that version of himself, tell him what waited on the other side of courage, of collective action. But perhaps it wasn't necessary. The future he'd once feared had arrived, not with a roar, but with a quiet, undeniable strength. It was kinder, more just, than he had dared to imagine. The first truly warm day of the year arrived. Without warning, sunlight spilling across the river and through Elijah's windows like an invitation to breathe. He opened them wide, letting the air move through the apartment, carrying with it the distant sounds of traffic, laughter, life. A community continuing, thriving, without waiting for permission. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing, aware of how rare it once felt to exist without tension. Coiled somewhere inside his chest, he had learned something profound over the past year. Justice wasn't a fragile truce. It didn't shatter the moment you stopped guarding it. It strengthened the more they trusted in their collective power. That afternoon, Elijah received a message from Jamal, a young activist he'd been mentoring. It was short, but potent. "Elijah, I spoke truth to power today. I chose the path of integrity, not compromise. Thank you for showing me the way." Elijah smiled, set the phone down, and felt a quiet sense of continuity. Whatever they had lost in the past, it was no longer a vacuum. It had become a bridge. In the evening, he met Aisha for dinner again, this time at a small place near the river. They ate slowly, talking about ordinary things, community projects, new initiatives, the strange comfort of routines. At one point, Aisha paused and studied him with the same careful expression. She'd worn the night she first hugged him after everything fell apart. "You carry the weight differently now, Elijah," she said. Elijah met her gaze. "The burden isn't gone, Aisha. But now it fuels the fight. Rather than crushing the spirit," she nodded, satisfied, and changed the subject without ceremony. Walking home afterward, Elijah took the long route. Passing streets he rarely visited. He liked the anonymity of it, the way unfamiliar places reminded him how vast the world still was, how many battles still needed to be fought. He thought about how narrowly their lives had once been confined by systemic expectations, by a single, oppressive narrative. The realization no longer filled him with regret. It filled him with a profound, liberating relief. Their worth was inherent, not granted. At home, he found another envelope waiting by the door. This one bore the logo of the legal team that had fought alongside them. For a split second, an old reflex stirred. Then it faded. He opened it calmly. It was the final decree, the official acknowledgement of their victory against the discriminatory policy. No pending actions, no follow-ups, just liberation, rendered in formal language. Elijah placed the letter with the others, in a folder he rarely opened anymore. He didn't feel the need to mark the occasion with fanfare. True liberation, he'd learned, wasn't always a roar, but often a quiet, resolute step forward. Later that night, he sat on the balcony again, watching the river carry reflections of the city's lights downstream. He thought about the word betrayal, how heavy it had once felt, how it had shaped every decision in the months that followed. He understood now that betrayal was not just about what someone did to you, but also about the insidious silence, the complicity of those who looked away, who allowed the narrative of oppression to persist. Forgiveness, too, had taken on a different shape. It wasn't absolution for the oppressors. It wasn't reconciliation with injustice. It was the fierce decision to heal, to stop letting the wounds of the past dictate their present, to prove that their spirit could not be broken. One weekend, on impulse, Elijah accepted an invitation to join a community outreach trip to a rural town. Facing similar injustices, the journey was long, the challenges more complex than he expected, but he welcomed the strain. At the town square, surrounded by hopeful faces, a young voice asked, "Elijah, do you ever fear the fight will break us again?" Elijah looked out at the crowd, his voice clear. "It's worth it." As they prepared to leave, he walked beside Aisha. Conversation flowed easily again, unforced, grounded. At one point, she asked, "Do you ever worry about trusting the system again?" He didn't answer immediately. He watched the path ahead, the way each step required attention. "But not fear. I worry more about not trusting our own strength, our own voice, our collective power," he said finally. "As long as we hold on to that, we will rise." She smiled, accepting the answer without probing. That night, back in his apartment, Elijah felt tired in the best possible way. He showered, changed, and opened the journal once more. He reread the 3 sentences written there, then added another line beneath them. "We don't chase freedom, we embody it. We don't wait for justice, we build it, step by resilient step." He closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf. As he prepared for bed, Elijah reflected on the strange symmetry of their journey. The story had begun in the crucible of systemic injustice, a community fractured, a legacy threatened. It had felt like destruction. But destruction, he now understood, was often the brutal, necessary clarity that ignited the revolution of the spirit. He turned off the lights and lay in the dark. The city breathed around him, a symphony of resilience. No lingering dread, no shadow of past battles waited in the dawn, no arguments rehearsed, no version of himself he needed to abandon to appease the architects of injustice. Sleep came, deep and earned, and somewhere beyond the quiet, beyond the lessons learned and the heavy losses, beyond the unexpected grace of a united front, Elijah knew one thing with certainty. The man who had once stood in the hollowed-out shell of his community, calm in the face of systemic betrayal, had not been broken. He had been waking up. The message arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, so unremarkable that Elijah almost ignored it. His phone vibrated on the worn wooden table. While he reviewed notes from a youth empowerment session, sunlight, a lazy golden stripe, Stretched across the floor, he glanced at the screen, expecting a community alert or a question from his team. Instead, it was a name he hadn't seen in months, Director Albright. He didn't open it right away. He set the phone down, finished his thought, closed the notebook, and only then picked it up again. That alone told him how much had truly changed. "I heard about the Beacon Mentorship Program," the message read. "People say you've been helping a lot of them find their voice. I didn't think you'd become this version of yourself. I guess I just wanted to say, I see you now. No apology, no request, no attempt to reopen old wounds. Just an observation sent too late to matter the way she might have hoped." Elijah stared at the words, searching his spirit for the reaction that once would have followed. There was no spike of anger, no ache of longing for a past he'd outgrown, just a distant awareness, like hearing about a storm in a city he no longer called home. He typed a reply, then deleted it, typed another, deleted that too in the end. He locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket without responding. Some conversations didn't need a final word. Silence, he'd learned, could be an answer without being a punishment. That evening, he met a small group of young leaders at a bustling community cafe. They talked about navigating systemic barriers, the fear of failure, the pressure to appear successful before feeling secure in their identities. Elijah listened more than he spoke, offering guiding questions instead of definitive conclusions. When one of them admitted they felt guilty for wanting a life of dignity their families, burdened by generations of struggle, didn't yet understand, Elijah said gently, "Guilt is often the price of growth. That doesn't make it wrong." The words surprised him. They were true because he had lived them. Walking home afterward, the Beacon district felt alive in a way it never had before. Streetlights flickered on. Families gathered on stoops. Strangers shared knowing smiles. Elijah felt connected to it all, without being pulled under by its weight. He realized that for the first time, he wasn't measuring his life against anyone else's expectations. Not Director Albright's, not society's limiting narratives, not even his own old fears. At home, he cooked dinner, slowly savoring the ritual. He thought about how his past had once revolved around anticipation, waiting for validation, waiting for acceptance, waiting for the next shift in the oppressive mood. Now, his life revolved around presence. He was where he was, fully. Later that night, he dreamed again of the house. But this time it wasn't empty. It was simply a structure, neutral and quiet, doors open, windows letting in the fresh air of change. When he woke, his heart was steady. Weeks passed. Spring deepened into early summer, the river thick with reflections of green and gold. Elijah hosted another small gathering, community elders and young activists mingling without pretense. Laughter filled the room, overlapping conversations, weaving together into something warm and unforced. At one point, Elijah stepped into the kitchen to refill drinks and paused, leaning against the counter. This, he thought, was what true safety felt like. Not certainty, not control, just ease and shared purpose. Someone knocked lightly on the counter behind him. It was Aisha, a fellow organizer, smiling, holding two glasses. "You disappeared," she said. "I was making sure the revolution didn't burn." Elijah replied, a twinkle in his eye. They stood there for a moment, side by side, the joyous noise of the room fading into the background. There was no urgency between them, no need to define what this was or might become. And that, Elijah realized, was the difference. He wasn't reaching for connection to fill a void. He was offering space because he had it, in abundance. As the evening wound down and guests filtered out, Elijah helped clean up, stacking plates, wiping counters. When the door finally closed behind the last person, the apartment settled into a comfortable quiet. He stood in the center of the room, breathing in the faint scent of food and candle wax, and felt something close to gratitude press against his ribs. He thought back to the night. Everything had cracked open, the systemic betrayal, the hollow promises that didn't belong, the calm that had scared him. Because it felt like surrender, he understood now that it hadn't been surrender at all. It had been resolve. Betrayal had taken much from him, but it had also stripped away illusions he'd been clinging to out of fear. It had forced him to ask questions he'd avoided. For years, Who am I when the system tries to erase me? What do I tolerate to feel accepted? What does it cost me to stay silent? The answers had changed everything. Before going to bed, Elijah opened his journal one last time. That night, he reread the lines he'd written over the past months, each one a marker of becoming, rather than merely surviving. He added one more, his handwriting steady. They tried to break my spirit. Instead, they forged my purpose. I didn't lose my fight. I found our collective strength. He closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay down as the city hummed softly outside. There was no sense of an ending, no dramatic finality, just continuation. And that, Elijah knew now, was the most honest kind of victory there was. The following months unfolded with a gentleness Elijah hadn't known to expect. Not because life stopped testing him, but because he was ready. But Elias Vance no longer saw every systemic challenge as a personal threat. Obstacles rose, as they always would. Missed policy deadlines, strained community conversations, moments of profound doubt. Yet these no longer dictated the rhythm of his fight. They passed through him, leaving lessons, not scars. One morning, running along the city's historic riverfront, Elijah slowed to a walk. He watched the water curl around the bend, a timeless current. A year ago, his mind would have been a battlefield, rehearsing arguments against injustice, preparing for confrontations that might never materialize. Now, his thoughts were quieter, not empty, but uncluttered by fear, sharp with purpose. He understood. Peace wasn't the absence of history's pain, but memory without its domination. At the community center, he was asked to lead a new civil rights initiative. The request came with profound recognition, deep trust, and an authority he hadn't sought, but had earned through unwavering integrity. In the meeting where it was announced, he caught himself smiling, not from pride, but from a profound sense of alignment. This path, this fight, fit him. He didn't have to perform to belong. That evening, Aisha Khan called again. This time, her voice light with laughter, she'd taken his counsel, stepping away from a situation that demanded constant self-negotiation with an oppressive system. It hurts, she admitted, but it feels clean. That's how you know, Elijah affirmed. After the call, he stood in his modest kitchen, noticing how natural it felt to offer clarity, to guide, without losing himself in the collective pain. He had learned to care deeply without collapsing under the weight. Dr. Nia Imani, the revered elder from the Justice Retreat, became a steady presence. Their bond forged in shared purpose, never rushed into a label. They met for walks through the historic district, shared meals, exchanged thoughts that mattered, thoughts that could move mountains. She didn't pry into his past struggles, and he didn't hide it. When he spoke of the injustices he'd faced, he did so plainly, without bitterness, only resolve. One evening, as they watched the city lights ripple across the river, a tapestry of hope and struggle, she observed, "Elijah, you don't talk like someone trying to be believed." "No," Elijah replied, his gaze steady on the horizon. "I talk like someone who believes in the truth and in himself." She smiled, a profound acknowledgement. That was enough. Occasionally, the echo of compromise, of paths not taken, surfaced again, usually through second-hand whispers of those who chose comfort over conviction. They were rebuilding, struggling, learning. The details no longer stirred anything in him. He wished them no ill, but he no longer wished their influence near. That boundary, forged in fire, felt solid, humane, final. One afternoon, while sorting old campaign files, Elijah came across a faded photograph he'd forgotten to discard. It showed him years ago, on a beach, arms around a younger self, smiling into a future. They'd both imagined differently, a future of personal comfort, not collective liberation. He studied the image for a moment, not with longing, but with profound curiosity. He saw a young man doing the best he could with the understanding he had at the time. He placed the photo back in its envelope and sealed it, not to preserve it, but to acknowledge the journey. Then he stored it away, returning to the urgent demands of his day. That night, Elijah hosted another small gathering. Conversation flowed easily, laughter rising and falling like the rhythm of a drum circle. At one point, he found himself standing alone near the window, watching the people he cared about, the people he fought for, fill his space with warmth and unwavering resolve. The realization came softly, but with the force of a revelation. This life, this fight, wasn't compensation for what he'd lost to injustice. It was the powerful, undeniable result of what he'd chosen. Later, after everyone left, Elijah cleaned up slowly, unhurried. He felt tired, but it was the kind of tiredness that came from profound engagement, not soul-depleting exhaustion. He sat down with a cup of herbal tea and opened his journal. Again, he didn't add a sentence. This time, he didn't need to. The pages already held the unfolding narrative of a movement. As he prepared for bed, Elijah reflected on how easily he might have missed all of this, the solidarity, the victories, the profound purpose, if he'd chosen comfort over truth, if he'd stayed quiet, if he'd allowed the oppressor's narrative to become his identity. The thought sent a brief chill through him. Not fear, but profound respect for the moment he'd chosen differently, chosen freedom. He lay down and closed his eyes, listening to the familiar, resilient sounds of the city settling into night. His breathing was steady, his mind was clear. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own hard-won joys. He didn't need to know what they were yet, because for the first time, Elijah trusted himself to meet whatever came next, without disappearing into the shadows of doubt or despair. And that trust, hard-earned, quietly kept, was the real beginning of his story, even as his life continued on, open, powerful, and unmistakably his. The anniversary of the great setback, the public humiliation, passed without Elijah noticing at first. It was Aisha who mentioned it casually over lunch, stirring her coffee, as if she were talking about the weather. You know, it's been exactly a year since everything blew up, right? Elijah paused, his fork hovering midair. He searched his memory for the familiar jolt, some internal alarm that once marked dates like landmines. It didn't come. I didn't realize, he said honestly. That realization settled over him gently, like irrefutable proof. The date that once would have haunted him, that would have replayed itself in his mind with merciless clarity, had slipped by unnoticed, not because he was numb, but because it no longer owned him. That evening, he took a longer walk than usual, following the river until the city thinned and the water widened, carrying reflections of an endless sky instead of towering buildings. He sat on a worn bench and let the memory surface on its own terms, the unjust arrest, the mocking laughter, the emptiness of the community after the ruling, the calm that had felt like standing on the edge of something irreversible. He understood now that the calm hadn't been resignation to injustice. It had been recognition. The moment he stopped arguing with the harsh reality of the world around him, life moved on. Joggers passed. A couple argued softly, a child tugging at their parent's hand. Elijah felt connected to it all, without needing to insert himself into anyone else's narrative. This was new, this was earned. At the community center, the civil rights initiative he'd been leading reached a monumental milestone, earning quiet praise and real impact. He watched younger activists, once hesitant, grow more confident, more willing to question the systemic paths they'd been told were inevitable. Sometimes, they asked him how he learned to trust his convictions. He never gave them a single answer. He told them the truth instead. You learn by ignoring the whispers of doubt once too often, he said, and deciding you won't do it again. One night, after a late community meeting, Elijah returned home to find a small package at his door. No return address. Inside was the worn copy of the Freedom Papers he'd left behind at the Leadership Summit months earlier, the one he thought he'd lost. A note was tucked inside, handwritten, simple. You left this. It felt important. He sat at his table, flipping through the pages. His own underlying passages, his marginalia, stared back at him. Markers of a man learning to choose justice without compromise. He added one final line. Slower this time, deliberate. I stayed, not in the silence, but in the struggle. Dr. Imani, the elder from the summit, noticed the shift, too, though she didn't name it directly. One evening, as they prepared a community meal together, she watched him move through the kitchen. With easy familiarity, unguarded. You don't brace anymore, she said. For what? For things to fall apart. He considered that. I think I learned they don't fall apart all at once, he said. They unravel when you refuse to look, and they rebuild when you finally do. She nodded, accepting the answer without needing more. There were moments, of course, unexpected ones, when the past brushed against him. A protest chant on the radio, a government building that smelled like old battles, an offhand comment about the way things are at a dinner party. Each time, he noticed the memory, acknowledged it, and let it move on. He didn't owe the old narratives a seat at the table anymore. The name of the old, oppressive system surfaced one last time in a way Elijah hadn't anticipated. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing a former colleague, once a staunch defender of the status quo, in a different city, working a smaller job and living a quieter life. They seem different, they said carefully. Elijah smiled, not unkindly. I hope they are. That was the truth. Not forgiveness as performance, just release. On a quiet Sunday morning, Elijah woke early and watched the city come alive. From his window, he thought about how his story might sound to others, dramatic, vindictive, triumphant. He knew better. The real story had been quieter, harder, less cinematic than people imagined. It was the story of a man who stopped, abandoning his people. He dressed, grabbed his keys, and drove without a destination. Letting instinct guide him, he ended up back by the river, sunlight breaking through the clouds, water moving steadily forward. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, breathing in the cool air. He thought about the compromises he'd dismantled, the version of himself that had been brave enough to do it. Without applause, he felt a swell of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced. When Elijah finally turned away, it wasn't with a sense of ending, it was with momentum. The betrayal of justice had been real, the loss undeniable, but the healing had been deliberate, chosen, built one honest decision at a time. And as he walked back toward the city, toward the life he was still shaping, no one knew this with certainty. He had not survived the story, he had authored it. What came next? The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost deceptively ordinary. Elijah woke, worked, met people, rested. No dramatic turns, no sudden revelations. And yet, beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. He no longer waited for the system to prove itself safe. Before stepping forward, one evening, after a long day, he sat alone at the small table by his window. Papers spread out in front of him. They weren't legal documents this time. They were notes, ideas he'd been collecting slowly, almost accidentally, observations from community organizing sessions, questions people kept asking him, patterns he recognized, not just in others, but in the man he used to be. He hadn't planned it, but somewhere along the way, a quiet idea had taken shape, a freedom forum, not motivational, not performative, just a space for people who felt stuck between who they were told to be and who they truly were. The thought scared him. That was how he knew it mattered. He shared the idea with Aisha first. She read his notes carefully, then looked up at him. You know this isn't just about them, right? I know, Elijah said. It's about making sure I don't forget. She smiled. Then you should do it. The first session was small, smaller than he'd imagined. A borrowed room, folding chairs, coffee that had gone lukewarm. A handful of people showed up, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet desperation. Elijah stood at the front, hands loose at his sides, and resisted the urge to fill the silence. I'm not here to tell you how to fix your life, he began. I'm here to ask you why you keep postponing it. The room stilled. He didn't tell his story all at once. He let it surface where it was useful, where it clarified something others struggled to articulate. He spoke about the cost of staying silent, about the difference between loyalty to an unjust system and self-erasure, about how preparation for change wasn't betrayal. It was self-respect. When the session ended, no one rushed out. People lingered, talking softly, asking questions they'd never said out loud before. One man stayed behind, eyes tired, voice low. I thought walking away from the old ways would make me the villain, he said. Elijah nodded. Sometimes it does, but staying silent can make your spirit disappear. Driving home that night, Elijah felt something stir that he hadn't expected. Not pride, not adrenaline, but purpose, not the kind that demanded applause, the kind that asked for consistency. Dr. Imani joined him for dinner. Nights later, under the soft glow of a single lamp, Malik spoke of the community assembly. Aisha listened, her gaze unwavering, a silent anchor in his storm. When he finished, a quiet strength in her voice, she said, "You're not trying to fix them, are you?" Malik nodded. "No, I'm trying to awaken us. To speak the truth, out loud, for all to hear," he affirmed. "That's where the power lies." She whispered. Their bond, forged in shared purpose, deepened with every sunrise. It was a partnership built on unwavering respect, a shared space where ideas flourished without ego, where time was a canvas, not a constraint. When shadows of doubt appeared, they faced them head-on, together. This raw authenticity, this absence of pretense, felt foreign at first. A lifetime of navigating subtle biases had taught Malik to anticipate, to guess. But he embraced the discomfort, for it was the fertile ground of growth. True growth often arrives cloaked in challenge. One afternoon, sifting through dusty boxes in the community center, Malik unearthed a forgotten journal, filled with his own words from years past. Pages filled with pleas he'd never voiced, questions he'd diluted, needs he'd apologized for even feeling. They were echoes of a younger Malik, trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for him. He read them, each word a ghost of a forgotten battle, no shame, only a profound, aching compassion for the young man who believed his dignity was negotiable, for the spirit that had once believed survival meant shrinking, meant silencing. That night, he returned to the community garden, the sacred ground that had witnessed so many quiet awakenings. The soil ever yielding, indifferent to the past, yet faithful to the promise of new life. Malik leaned against the weathered fence, the scent of earth and hope filling his lungs. He thought of how easily his spirit could have been broken, how close he'd come to accepting the narrative of defeat, trapped in a story that denied his truth, denied his people's truth. He understood now, courage wasn't a roar. It didn't announce itself with grand speeches or ultimatums. It manifested in meticulous preparation, in unyielding boundaries, in the willingness to be misunderstood, rather than untrue. As he turned to leave, his phone vibrated. A message from a young woman who'd attended their last community assembly. "I spoke my truth to the council tonight," it read. "I don't know what comes next, but I didn't stay silent." Malik typed back, a simple, powerful reply. "That's everything," he wrote. Walking home, a profound satisfaction settled over him. The alignment of his inner conviction with his outward actions. The systemic betrayal that once threatened to define him had shrunk, not erased, but integrated into the tapestry of his purpose. It no longer demanded center stage, as Malik unlocked the door to the home he'd built. Brick by brick, truth by truth, piece by piece, he knew, with unshakable certainty, the man who had once sacrificed his peace to reclaim his dignity hadn't lost a battle. He had gained a voice for himself and for generations, a voice he intended to wield carefully, honestly, and without ever handing it away again. Sometimes, injustice doesn't arrive to destroy you. It arrives to awaken you. This story isn't about winning against an oppressor. It's about the fierce, quiet courage it takes to stop betraying your own spirit, your own people. Malik didn't heal because he sought revenge or proved he was right. He healed because he chose truth over comfort, clarity over systemic denial, and collective self-respect over the fear of standing alone. Real strength isn't always loud. It looks like meticulous preparation, like unshakable boundaries. It looks like being willing to dismantle what's familiar so you don't lose who you are, who your ancestors fought for you to be. If you're standing at a crossroads right now, unsure whether to stay silent or speak your truth, remember this: the cost of speaking out is visible, but the cost of staying silent is paid slowly, invisibly, in pieces of your very soul. Choose the path that lets you recognize the warrior in the mirror, the one who stands for justice. If this story ignited something within you, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Malik's journey resonated most deeply with your own fight for justice? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep, emotional, cinematic stories that remind us, in the fight for equality, we are never alone.